The Boston Tea Party. These words evoke images of rebellious colonists, chests of tea plunging into the harbor, and the defiant spirit of a nation on the cusp of revolution. It's a tale etched into the American consciousness, a pivotal moment where the desire for liberty clashed with imperial rule. But how much is historical fact, and how much is romanticized lore? The Boston Tea Party wasn't just an isolated act, it was the culmination of years of tension and political maneuvering. To understand that December night in 1773, we must journey back to colonial America. Imagine a time when the 13 colonies found themselves at odds with the British Crown. Restrictive policies and escalating taxes sowed seeds of discontent, sprouting into resistance. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, each new levy fueled indignation, forging a collective identity among colonists. The Tea Act of 1773, seemingly innocuous, proved the tipping point. Granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales ignited a firestorm of protest. It was the principle that cut deep. The colonists recognized a blatant attempt by the Crown to assert control and undermine their liberties. The Boston Tea Party wasn't merely about tea, it was about principles, about a people unwilling to bow to what they perceived as tyranny. It was a bold declaration that the colonists would not be pawns in a game of empire. But the popular narrative only scratches the surface of this complex event. It's time to delve deeper, to explore the nuances and lesser-known truths. Our journey takes us to December 16, 1773. Darkness had fallen upon Boston Harbor, cloaking the city in an eerie stillness. A group of colonists, some disguised as Native Americans, gathered under the veil of night. These were ordinary citizens, driven to extraordinary measures by a shared sense of injustice. They boarded 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, their destination, the chests of tea that lay within, symbols of British oppression. The scene that unfolded that night was not one of wanton destruction, but of calculated resistance. Chests were emptied into the harbor, the tea staining the water a murky brown, a tangible manifestation of colonial defiance. The choice of disguise, often misunderstood, was both symbolic and strategic. It represented a rejection of British identity, an embrace of a nascent American spirit, albeit one entangled in the complex racial dynamics of the time. The events of that night would reverberate far beyond the shores of Boston Harbor. News of the Tea Party spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of protests and fueling the growing movement for independence. The British response, swift and severe, would further solidify colonial resolve, pushing the two nations closer to the brink of war. The year is 1773. The American colonies, a patchwork of bustling port cities and sprawling farmlands, stand at a crossroads. Years of relative peace and prosperity under British rule were fading, replaced by a growing sense of unease, a simmering resentment that crackled beneath the surface of daily life. The seeds of this discontent were sown not on a battlefield, but in the halls of Parliament, thousands of miles across the Atlantic. For decades, the colonists had enjoyed a degree of autonomy, governing their own affairs, while reaping the benefits of being part of the vast British Empire. But the 7 Years' War, a costly conflict that pitted Britain against France and its allies, had left the Crown deeply in debt. To replenish its coffers, Parliament turned its gaze upon its colonies, enacting a series of taxes and regulations that struck at the heart of colonial liberty. The Sugar Act of 1764, the first in this wave of new levies, imposed taxes on molasses and other goods imported from non-British colonies. Though ostensibly designed to regulate trade, the act was seen by many colonists as a blatant attempt to raise revenue at their expense. Protests erupted, with merchants and landowners decrying the act as an infringement on their rights. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed through the streets, a rallying cry against what many perceived as tyranny. The Sugar Act, though met with resistance, proved to be just the beginning. Emboldened by its success in asserting its authority, Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, a far more provocative measure that directly taxed a wide range of printed materials in the colonies. Newspapers, legal documents, even playing cards, all were subject to this new tax, evidenced by the now infamous stamp that had to be affixed to each item. The Stamp Act ignited a firestorm of protest across the colonies. From Boston to Charleston, colonists organized boycotts of British goods, formed protest groups like the Sons of Liberty, and engaged in acts of defiance, often targeting tax collectors with intimidation and violence. The streets of colonial cities became stages for public demonstrations, with fiery speeches denouncing British oppression and calls for resistance growing louder by the day. The colonial response to the Stamp Act sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. Parliament, facing mounting pressure from British merchants whose businesses were suffering due to the boycotts, ultimately repealed the act in 1766. But the damage had been done. The seeds of mistrust and resentment had been sown, and the colonists, having tasted the power of collective action, were emboldened to resist further encroachments on their liberties. The repeal of the Stamp Act provided a brief respite, but the underlying tensions remained. Parliament, though forced to back down, had not abandoned its belief in its right to tax the colonies. In 1767, a new series of taxes, known as the Townshend Acts, were imposed on goods like tea, glass, and paper imported from Britain. Once again, the colonists erupted in protest, reviving boycotts and engaging in acts of civil disobedience. The Townshend Acts, however, contained a crucial difference from the Stamp Act. Instead of being a direct tax levied on the colonies, it was an indirect tax, imposed on goods at the point of importation. This distinction, though seemingly minor, was at the heart of the debate over parliamentary authority. The colonists argued that Parliament had the right to regulate trade, but not to impose internal taxes for the sole purpose of raising revenue. In 1770, after years of protests and escalating tensions, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend Acts. However, they made a fateful exception, the tax on tea. This seemingly minor concession was not an act of benevolence, but a calculated gambit. By retaining the tea tax, even as a symbolic gesture, Parliament sought to assert its ultimate authority over the colonies. It was a gamble that would have far-reaching consequences. The years following the partial repeal of the Townshend Acts were marked by a period of relative calm, but the embers of discontent continued to smolder. The issue of taxation without representation remained a festering wound, a constant reminder of the simmering tensions between the colonies and the mother country. The tea tax, though small, became a powerful symbol of British oppression, a daily reminder of the colonists' subordinate status. Throughout the colonies, a chorus of voices began to challenge the legitimacy of British rule. Writers, pamphleteers, and orators like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry used their words to stir public sentiment, arguing that the time had come for the colonies to break free from the shackles of imperial control. Secret societies like the Sons of Liberty continued to operate in the shadows, organizing resistance and preparing for the possibility of open conflict. The stage was set for a showdown. The colonists, emboldened by their past successes in resisting British policies and inspired by the rhetoric of liberty and self-determination, were no longer content to be mere subjects of the crown. The British, determined to assert their authority and unwilling to tolerate further defiance, seemed equally resolute in their determination to crush any hint of rebellion. The conflict, once a distant storm cloud, was about to break. The crisp December air hung heavy with anticipation as dusk settled over Boston. The cobblestone streets, usually bustling, were uncharacteristically quiet, the silence punctuated by distant ship bells. Word had spread. The East India Company's tea ships had arrived. Tensions had been simmering for weeks. Town meetings were held, fiery speeches delivered, and resolutions passed. The colonists were determined to take a stand. This was about principle, about drawing a line in the sand. As darkness enveloped the city, men in disguises converged near Griffin's Wharf. These were ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, artisans, merchants, even a few Native Americans. They were about to embark on a daring act of defiance, forever etching their names into history. The atmosphere crackled with nervous energy as the men gathered, their whispered conversations barely audible above the lapping of the harbor waters against the wooden wharves. Lanterns cast flickering shadows, obscuring faces, and lending an air of clandestine urgency to the proceedings. Among them were figures who would become legends: Samuel Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, their names forever linked to this pivotal night of rebellion. Instructions were whispered, final preparations made. Axes and hatchets, tools of their everyday trades, were now instruments of resistance, their weight imbued with symbolic significance. The men, their faces grim with determination, donned their disguises. Some smeared soot on their faces, others wrapped blankets around themselves in a rough approximation of Native American garb. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. By disguising themselves, they were shedding their identities as British subjects and embracing a new defiant spirit, one that rejected the authority of the crown. Meanwhile, throughout the city, an undercurrent of anxiety mixed with anticipation. Many citizens, though sympathetic to the cause, watched from their darkened windows with a mixture of trepidation and excitement. The presence of British troops stationed in Boston heightened the tension. Would they intervene? Would this night of protest escalate into something far more dangerous? The fate of the city, and perhaps the colonies, seemed to hang in the balance. With a signal, the men, now numbering over 100 strong, moved swiftly and silently towards the three ships at anchor: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. The cold December air did little to dampen their resolve as they boarded the vessels, their footsteps muffled by the darkness and the creaking of the ship's timbers. The element of surprise was on their side. The ship's crews, caught off guard, offered little resistance. The chests of tea, stacked neatly in the ship's holds, were quickly located. With a mixture of fury and precision, the men set upon their task. Axes swung, hatchets chopped, the sounds of splintering wood echoing in the night. Chests were ripped open, their contents, the finest black tea from the East Indies, emptied into the harbor. The air filled with the pungent aroma of tea, a bittersweet scent that mingled with the salty tang of the sea. For 3 hours the work continued, each chest emptied a symbolic blow against British oppression. The waters of Boston Harbor, usually a conduit for commerce and trade, ran dark with the discarded tea, a potent symbol of colonial defiance. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The men melted back into the city, leaving behind them a scene of chaos and the pungent aroma of tea, a scent that would forever be associated with this audacious act of rebellion. The decision to disguise themselves as Native Americans, while a strategic move to avoid immediate identification, has been a subject of much debate and interpretation among historians. Some argue it was solidarity with Native Americans, who were also struggling against British colonialism. Others see it as a reflection of complex attitudes towards Native Americans. The colonists recognized the injustice of British rule and saw a shared struggle for autonomy. The image of the noble savage resonated with some colonists. However, the disguise was also cultural appropriation. The act of disguising themselves as Native Americans while displacing them from their lands highlights the contradictions in the colonial experience. The symbolism of the disguise, like the Boston Tea Party itself, cannot be easily categorized. It serves as a reminder that history is not a simple narrative of heroes and villains, but a complex tapestry woven from a multitude of perspectives, motivations, and often conflicting ideologies. The Boston Tea Party, a pivotal moment in the struggle for American independence, continues to spark debate and reflection, challenging us to grapple with the nuances of the past and their enduring legacy in the present. News of the Boston Tea Party reached London in late January 1774, sparking outrage and leading to the coercive acts designed to punish and isolate Boston. The Boston Port Act shut down the city's harbor, devastating its economy. Ships were turned away, and wharves stood silent. Merchants faced ruin, and shopkeepers struggled. Yet, amidst the hardship, Boston's spirit of resilience emerged. The coercive acts stripped Massachusetts of self-governance and imposed British control. The Quartering Act inflamed tensions by housing British troops in colonists' homes. News of these acts united the colonies in outrage. What began as a local dispute now pushed the colonies towards rebellion. The colonies rallied to support Boston with donations and coordinated resistance. The First Continental Congress convened, issuing a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They called for a boycott of British goods. The stage was set for conflict. The shots at Lexington and Concord would soon ignite a full-blown war for independence. The Boston Tea Party is often simplified in popular narratives. The reality is more nuanced, with dissenting voices and complex motivations. Some saw it as reckless, fearing harsher reprisals. The decision to destroy the tea was not universally approved. Boston was divided on how to address British policies. Loyalists feared defiance would provoke harsher reprisals. Even among supporters of colonial rights, there were divisions. The destruction of the tea solidified these divisions, leading towards revolution. The Boston Tea Party had real consequences. The British launched a full-scale investigation. Some participants fled, others faced social ostracism. The coercive acts were a direct response, punishing Boston collectively. The Boston Tea Party was part of a larger wave of colonial protests. Similar acts of defiance occurred in other ports. It became a rallying cry for the independence movement. It was a pivotal moment in the struggle for liberty. The Boston Tea Party symbolizes resistance against tyranny. It was about the right to self-governance and resisting oppression. It inspired the fight for independence and the birth of the United States. Its legacy extends beyond the newly formed nation. The Boston Tea Party reminds us that the pursuit of liberty is ongoing. History is complex, with multiple perspectives and motivations. The colonists' actions reflect both strategic moves and moral ambiguities. It invites us to question assumptions and engage with the complexities of the past.